Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Peppis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Michael Copperman, Senior Instructor of English at the University of Oregon. He teaches writing to low-income, first-generation students of diverse backgrounds. Copperman is also an accomplished and awarded creative writer. His writing has appeared in many periodicals, including the Oxford American, The Sun, Creative Nonfiction, and Salon. His memoir, Teacher, 2 Years in the Mississippi Delta, published in September 2016, details his experience as a member of Teach for America in a rural black public school. Thanks, Mike, for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Just for our viewers who may not be totally clear, just tell us quickly what Teach for America is.
Yeah, so Teach for America is, for the last 25 years, has been putting recent college graduates into under-resourced schools. And their sort of mission is that regardless of the amount of privilege that a child is born into, that they have the opportunity to get an excellent education. They have expanded massively at one point in their life, and now recently they've sort of become a little bit smaller, but they're high profile in the sense that they have been one of the organizations that's sort of driving the educational reform movement, so to speak. Yeah.
What led you to sign up for Teach for America? Were you driven by a passion to go out there and help people and change the world?
You know, I was super idealistic. I was also quite naive. I believed, as I think a lot of the members of my generation did, that I could do anything and that all I had to do was figure out exactly what that was. And so when I saw the organization, the rhetoric, you know, really moved me, this idea that I could be the change I wanted to become, you know, so yeah.
Did you aspire to be a teacher?
I wasn't intending to be an educator at all, which has been one of the things I think that I'm most thankful for in terms of the opportunities that Teach for America has given me. Meaning that those couple years in the Delta made me finally into an educator.
So you were taught as much as you taught.
I think that's probably fair.
How did Teach for America prepare you and your cohort for the classroom? What kind of training do you guys get?
Well, so we trained for 5 weeks in Houston. You know, the training was as best as I think they could manage, very practical. Half the day was devoted towards teaching children who were fairly similar to the children in backgrounds that we were going to be teaching. In Houston, it was Latino and black students in a low-income area who needed summer classes. But, you know, there were 4 of us in a cohort teaching, you know, like 10 students for 3 or 4 hours a day, and then the rest of the time was devoted towards a sort of large, as best they could, applied curriculum and practicum that was meant to cram, you know, a year Masters of Teaching into about 5 weeks. So it was inadequate, but then I'm not sure anything would have been adequate. Yeah.
So you get to the Mississippi Delta. Tell us a little bit about the community and the school where you were assigned.
Well, so the community that I taught in, as much of the Delta is, and the Delta is, of course, the alluvial floodplain of the Mississippi, so it's a geographic feature in Mississippi and Arkansas, and it's where the legacy of King Cotton is the greatest. So there are, you know, there is nearly 80%, the population of blacks in the area is 80%, which is higher than anywhere else in the U.S. It's extremely poor. Whites still own 95% of the small businesses. The schools are segregated today. I just was back there about a month ago, and they were segregated 12 years ago when I taught there. In '71, when you know, the Supreme Court said 17 years after Brown v. Board that you actually have to do this, within several years, private academies had been established for white students, usually associated with churches throughout that area. And the situation remains very similar today. So, you know, in the school that I taught in, there was something like 550 students. All of them were black. There were no white children at the school that I taught in. And this was a K through 5 school that I'm talking about. And I taught 4th grade there.
How many students in the class?
My first year, something like 25 or 26. My second year, I had a smaller class. I think I want to say I started out with 18 or 19. Yeah.
So you go to this community, 80% black, 100% black students in your classes. You're not a black man.
No,
What was that like?
In fact, I was, how how should I put this? I was between the black-white binary of the Delta in all sorts of ways, right? My family background is interesting. My father's side of the family was the American Jewish left. So, you know, Russo-Polish Jews, fairly left-leaning and activist in nature. And then my mother's family are third generation, you know, Japanese, but Japanese Hawaiian, right? I'm fourth generation. And so I'm somewhat ethnically ambiguous in appearance. You know, I've often been mistaken for being Latino or being any kind of Asian you can put down, or being, you know, a native of Spain. And so there's always been Native American. That's another one that happens. In Mississippi, I made no sense to folks. And the black students had never seen an Asian person before. So to them, I was, you know, that Mexican man, or I was a Chinaman, right? I was the living embodiment of Jackie Chan, who was the only, you know, Asian that they were particularly familiar with at the time.
And this wasn't just in the classroom, but this is when you're in town and going to the grocery store.
Yeah, in the greater community as well. And you know, it's a very divided community. So I spent the bulk of my time in the public school, and the public schools are, you know, except for maybe there were a few other white teachers and a number of other core members who were also teaching in the school that I was in. But otherwise, the staff was all black. The children were all black. And then within the greater community, you know, I didn't have a lot of reason to necessarily interact directly with whites, but because I was different, folks would approach me about that difference. And what would happen again and again was that, you know, people would say something which I think to our ears would sound fairly uncodedly racist. You know, they would say something about Asians, or if they found out I was from Japan, about sushi or something, and then they would go on to tell me about the monstrous children that I taught, or they would tell me that I should understand that, you know, it's not like the North, because, you know, there are good blacks and bad blacks, but the good ones all left for the cities. I felt sometimes as if I was being sort of claimed in some strange way, like as if I was supposed to move on to that side of some sort of great divide. Mm-hmm. And I certainly wasn't prepared for that, having come from, you know, Eugene originally, and then having been at Stanford.
Would you read us a passage?
Sure, I'd love to. And this is from near the end of the book, I think. Of those years in the Delta, much is gone. And what remains are moments and images and voices, all of it freighted with the burden of how I was and all I imagined I could achieve. It's impossible now to touch the fever dream of changing the world one lesson at a time, undoing injustice by benchmark met and lessons learned, any more than I can regain the frustrated young man who once tossed a boy out the classroom door. Mostly now even the children are hard to recall, faces retreating to shadow, voices receding to clamor, and mostly that absence is a relief and that silence is a blessing. It means that finally I can let go a little, leave off the herring of conscience and rest. The Delta changed me. People speak of how idealism ought to be tempered by experience and think it a benign process, growing older, becoming wiser. They're wrong. You can't restore faith. I wouldn't have been teaching more than a decade now at the University of Oregon if it weren't for those years in the Delta. Would long ago have traded in a Stanford degree for a job with status and pay. Each day in the classroom with 18-year-olds of low-income, diverse background, I see my fourth graders grown up, and a part of me imagines that somehow I'm speaking directly to the children for whom I wanted so much. Yet back in Promise, children I taught walk the dusty streets headed nowhere, and I don't have it in me to help them. It isn't work ethic I lack, but the courage to fail again, to fail to save a child who doesn't have a fighting chance. Some nights I lay awake bargaining, trying to get back to the man I was before I went, and imagine the children a world away in shacks on the wrong side of the tracks, hearing the bark of a stray dog or the far-off whistle of a train bound elsewhere. I left them behind, and so I can't let go. And if I close my eyes, I can still hear their voices. Come on and pitch it, Mr. C. Hey, how you gonna do me like that? That don't count as no strike. What the capital of Oregon is, Mr. Copperman? Everybody live in a tree out there, right? How come you always got to talk so careful, Mr. C? All like, hello, my children. Today is a day when we speak using all the words we have in our dictionary. Mr. Copperman, how come you not black and you not white, but you say you like Nas? Ain't you got some Asian person music or something, so you ain't stealing folks' music? Mr. Copperman, how you know you don't like a Kool-Aid pickle if you ain't had none? Ooh-wee, look at his face. He doesn't like them pickles. Mr. Copperman, this is a poem I wrote for you. Roses are red, violets is blue. You making a face like you stepped in poo. Man, shoot, that ain't nothing. That's like half a poem. Here's a real poem. Roses is dead. And Violet's dead too, because I'm on fire and this just burned you. That's not no poem. You can't use no swear words in no poem. Mr. Copperman, is that a poem? Mr. Copperman, Mr. Copperman, Mr. Copperman. And they're with me again, clamoring to be heard, bright-eyed, cheeks shiny, hair shaved close on the boys, or braided to tight rows or pulled back clean in buns on the girls, their uniform polos starched and their khakis belted tight, sitting straight and listening, learning position, or slouching beneath their desks with arms crossed, or buried in a beanbag chair or crouched deep in a kicker stands at the plate on a kickball field, or speaking while doing the heel-toe two-step at a sock hop beneath the strobing lights, arms and hands waving, faces upraised, demanding my attention and calling out, joking, declaiming, being absurd and serious and smart and so full of joy and anger and outrage and curiosity. Such kids. And so it is that the further I am from the Delta, the clearer that I hear them. Perhaps this nearness is how the past clarifies as it recedes from reach, so that finally what's left is distilled, too perfect to bear. Those kids are, after all, no longer children, but full-grown men and women now, who likely have children of their own, and jobs and aspirations, and adult burdens. They're no longer my charge, but they're with me as they were, their faces bright, and voices loud. And because what happened then is inalterable, it's possible now to love them purely as they were, without the need to have them behave or achieve. Perhaps that's why I've begun to forgive myself for having failed them, because maybe I didn't fail them after all, any more than they failed me. They were bright, good kids, beautiful in all they didn't know and all they wanted. The poverty that limited them could be ugly, but they were not. And while I could be ugly in all of my frustration and the arrogant naivete of youth, I was not such a bad teacher. Not as good as they deserved, but as good of a teacher under the circumstances as I could manage. There was nothing wrong with me or wrong with them. Though there was so much trauma and trouble and loss along the way that for a decade I couldn't understand why I kept gazing back, mulling over what was gone. Finally, it's simple. I left a part of my heart in the Delta. Since I left, I've always held back a little. I'm willing to risk everything again the way I did back when I didn't know you couldn't change the world through force of will. A part of me will always remain with those kids, and I'll always yearn to return to them, to be with them once more and hear the cadence of their voices, see their upturned, eager faces, and have time for just one more chapter read aloud, one more times table and one more lesson, one less chance to be there with them and so be whole again, to be once more simply and only teacher.
It's a wonderful passage. It's a wonderful book. You actually have gone back there.
I was just back about a month ago traveling with this book, which was actually strange. But I'm in touch with a lot of the kids on social media, and so I arranged to meet those who I was in touch with, and then I found out about other kids when I was there, and so I got the opportunity to meet with 3 or 4 of them.
Tell us about one of those kids.
Well, so the young woman who begins this book, who in the book I call Serenity Werner, who came from a very, very difficult background. I think I say that the poverty that she came from was made the other children's poverty seem positively first world. She loved to read, gained a bunch of reading levels in my class. There was a time when I thought of her as being sort of a success story. And on returning to the Delta after 6 years, I came on the burned out shell of her house and was unable to find out what had happened to her, and had a lot of fear about that for a lot of years. Without sort of giving away exactly what happens, well, within the book, I can say I was in touch with her briefly and found out that she was okay, that she had been taken as a ward of the state, that she had actually gone on to be successful in school, that she still loved to read. And that was, something like junior year of high school. And then MySpace, which I had found her through, restarted itself or something, right? Erased everything. And I couldn't find her on Facebook, and so I didn't know what had become of her. And my experience teaching low-income students here at the University of Oregon is that there are no guarantees. Just because a child goes to college, we lose a vast majority of our students, actually. Mm-hmm. I think when they make it to a 4-year institution, that's not really the end. There are issues of belonging, there are issues of preparation, there are all sorts of barriers to success when you don't have resources, when you have to work 2 jobs just to put yourself through. And so I had no idea what had actually become of Serenity Werner. I got to the Delta, I asked after the kids with the first young man who's also in the book, who was really happy to see me and had just graduated college. And he told me, that she had a different name on Facebook, and so I went and found her. So I sat with her for about an hour on the campus of the 4-year institution where she is about to graduate. She's entering her last semester. And she is so immensely smart and self-contained and adult, and also so much the same in some ways as she was. And what I mean is that she was courageous in ways that I think I certainly was never prepared to recognize or really understand. What does it take for a kid to do that? Well, takes more than I think most of us really have or know. She told me that she forgave me anything that I had done in the classroom when it happened, which was, I think more than most of us can expect. She remembered every detail of that year. She remembered a dozen things that I didn't remember, most of which were good. So, I think that there is real possibility sometimes, even for, in an experience that I think, as I describe in this book, is tremendously complicated and ambiguous, and where, the story is not really like Dangerous Minds or whatever of the, the 100 white savior, narratives that we tend to get, in which, a middle class or upper middle class young white man or woman comes to a minority community and saves children from the poverty that they enter in by, I don't know, telling them they care, right? It wasn't quite that simple.
One of the things I think that's most striking about the book is how scrupulous you are in recounting all the missteps and all the failures and all the guilt that you experienced. There's just a ream of the stories. It's so heartbreaking and powerful. And always your commitment to the students, your relationships with those students, your desire to help those students always shines through despite your
well, and I think that that's a more real story. I also think that part of that is what happens when you take a 22-year-old and you tell them that they are going to remake the world and the burden of history and persistent inequality and all of these social hierarchies, through a year in the classroom, right, or 2 years in the classroom, or whatever the long-term impacts are down the road. I don't even know that theory of change is wrong, per se. I think going back to Mississippi, I realized maybe what I had done resonates out of sight more deeply than I had realized. But, I wanted guarantees. I wanted impacts now. I wanted to see that, all of the children were suddenly above grade level, and, that the poverty that often led to tremendous obstacles to their success in their daily lives had been somehow magically erased. And I mean, it's absurd. And I wouldn't say I thought that was going to magically happen. I think that's unfair. But I didn't realize that what really happens when you don't have any barriers, when you don't have any sort of self-protection within that, right? When you sort of naively go in with open arms, you end up trying to take on more than you possibly can bear. And I think that the guilt at my attempts to do that and how impossible that was for me to take on, it wasn't really my burden to take on, right? I think that that's sort of the center of the book in a lot of ways. What's interesting in looking back is that I think that maybe I took my failures a little bit harder. The kids didn't see those things necessarily as failures, or at least I tried, right, in my own inadequate ways. I think that writing this book, it was necessary for me to make myself culpable. If I was going to write about the lives of these children that I came in contact with, then I think I needed to admit the ways that I was a part of this system, which is not a just educational system, the ways that I was a part of America, right? And in America, where I was benefiting from resources which in some ways I had done nothing to earn.
What you've said now begins to imply I don't know if I'd say a critique, an evaluation of Teach for America. And it has come under significant criticism, but your view, I think, is critical but tempered. Tell us, in retrospect, what do you think about the value of Teach for America?
I think that I'm thankful to the organization for making me understand what conditions were like in places unlike Eugene, Oregon, or unlike, Stanford. And when I say this, even the places that I was able to move within Eugene, Oregon, or within Stanford, because if you go out River Road or if you cross the bridge into Springfield, there are many low-income districts where the majority of children are on free lunch and where kids actually are facing a lack of opportunity fairly similar in some ways to Mississippi. Not the same, but socioeconomic inequality is fairly savage. And our districts tend to be fairly segregated in terms of socioeconomic status, even when the burden of history in a place like Oregon is not going to be precisely the same in terms of the racial dynamics. So, I think that Teach for America made me understand that I needed to learn about those issues and pay attention. I think they made me a better person in the long run by way of having to reckon with these children and carry their stories and their voices and their lives with me, understanding how little I could actually do to necessarily affect them. They led to me teaching here at the University of Oregon for the last 11 years, teaching students who sort of remind me of those kids in the Delta, though they're young adults. But an 18-year-old college freshman is not so different from a college senior. And children are children, I think, in some ways. So I think, to come back to this question of the organization, I guess what I'm saying is, for me, it made me into an educator. And so I'm thankful for that opportunity. I think the organization has overstepped its bounds in some ways in the past, and they have had to change their positions. And what's interesting is that they've made these shifts at a time when they've taken so many blows publicly. The organization has lost its luster in many ways. I think rightfully so. I think they got themselves into the wrong side of some very complicated educational issues. I think the reform efforts were sometimes outsiders coming in ways that really disserved the actual local communities there. But I will say two things in their defense. The first is that when I just went back to Mississippi, I did meet with the director, and then I went into what they call an all-corps and looked at the young teachers who were there. There were only 75 of them this year. The director said that there were 2,400 requests for Teach for America teachers. And what I mean is that there's such a shortage of teachers in Mississippi, folks won't go to teach there. Often classrooms go unfilled, they go filled by permanent substitutes. 2,400 and then 75 means that you're not changing the whole school system, but it also means that there's a tremendous need. And so I don't think they're displacing teachers the way that I think has driven a lot of the criticism of Teach for America in some districts where there are highly qualified teachers, and then Teach for America is trying to be a part of the community. The second thing I would say, both in the Delta and then nationally, is that when I walked into the all-corps, I was stunned. And what I mean is that nearly half of the corps were 22-year-olds of diverse background. I think in Mississippi, the director said something between 40 and 45% of the Delta Corps are people of color, including, I think, nearly a quarter African American. And they've gone out of their way to recruit within the communities that are there. There's a total change from when I was there. When I was one of, it was 1 in 10, perhaps, when I was there. And nationally, the diversity numbers for the organization are something above 50%. So it's really interesting to me that Teach for America has become one of the greatest engines in terms of bringing highly qualified, diverse, high-achieving young people into classrooms at a time when, nationally we place something like 7% of incoming teachers are not white. And we know the impacts of that are tremendous. To me, that's almost enough to obviate a lot of my other concerns, because I think that change alone is actually really important. I still have my quibbles.
If you were to return to that 4th grade classroom, would your approach to teaching them be different?
I think I would, put this, I think I would have more fun. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but I think I would have the confidence to know that I could weather the worst of the management issues. I think I would understand the degree to which, while management is its own sort of art, the things that often children bring to classrooms are not necessarily about you as a teacher. I think I would have less self-worth invested in achievement with a capital A, or in students, as I think I said in the passage, behaving. And I think that would probably lead to better behavior. I was at my best when I was at my warmest and most forgiving. And I found that hard to sustain because the levels of frustration and my inability to get much traction or get kids to do what I wanted them to do, I think in some ways sort of prevented me from enjoying what I was doing and from sort of being, present in ways with some of those kids that maybe I could have been.
There's a wonderful passage near the end of the book where you reflect on the students who you didn't notice enough during the time. You've gotten this perspective, I think, that's really valuable.
Well, and it's interesting to me, we get course evaluations here, right, every quarter, and I'm teaching, a very at-risk body of students who are also, wonderful and much more prepared than I think many people would, I think any community college teacher has a body of students that's very similar to those that I tend to teach here. And I always miss someone. Like, there's always some student who I think I've done a good job with. I've met with every single student. I have conferences as, the center of my pedagogy, and I think, I've done a really wonderful job. And I'll get these course evals, and one student will have just felt so ignored and so unseen and so sort of misrepresented, or they will have taken something that I said that, I meant in one way and taken it to mean something else that, I would never have meant. And I think I take that to heart, because I think that teaching is a kind of art, and it's also a really meaningful piece of social contact, right? It's a role that you fill in some ways. I think most teachers can see that, right? If we look back, you realize that probably there was always someone that you overlooked, right?
Oh, yes. What are a couple of the major impacts that the experience had on your life now that you look back? I mean, when you think, what did it do to me? What did it change me? How did it teach me? How do you answer that?
Yeah, and I think I say in the memoir at some point, I guess this is what you do when you release a book, right? But then I finished the last draft of this book 2.5 years ago. So I think that long term I was fortunate to have had this experience. I think I've also said at different points that this is, it was the crucible that sort of created me or made me into an educator. I think that mix of emotions is easy to understand. I was, I didn't have that period in my mid-20s where I sort of messed around and made mistakes and, traveled and had no responsibilities. Instead, I put myself into a situation in which I was unable to bear the burden of the sheer weight of responsibility, at least as I tried to take it on. And I think that changed me in certain ways that I used to think was not the fault of the children, but was in some ways unfair. And I think in retrospect, it was just fine.
It was just fine.
It was just fine. And what I mean is, we all have to come of age sometime. I think that I'm thankful for having gone to the Delta. And I'm thankful for the opportunity to have known those kids, or to know some of them now with the young adults that they've become. Just like I'm fortunate to have had this last 10 years in the classroom, I thought when I started teaching that I was going to atone in some weird way, right? Meaning it was just especially important to me to teach well, because I understood what it was to teach not well and wish that you could do much better. And I've sort of found within that, my own sort of role as a teacher. I mean, I'm happy when I enter the classroom most days. It's a pleasure to be there with those kids. It's an opportunity. I don't feel a lot of trepidation most times that I enter the classroom. I feel glad to have the opportunity to be there and talk to those kids. So.
Well, we are very glad that you took the time to talk to us, and we're thankful for the work that you do at the University of Oregon. And I know that the students that you have worked with are thankful too. We really appreciate it.
Well, it means a lot.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
I've been speaking with Michael Copperman, Senior Instructor of English at the University of Oregon. He teaches writing to low-income, first-generation students of diverse backgrounds. His memoir, Teacher, 2 Years in the Mississippi Delta, published in September 2016, details his experience as a member of Teach for America in rural Black public schools. You should definitely get this book. It's a great read. Thanks so much for watching.